In the final days of World War II, as the Third Reich crumbled around them, the most dangerous criminals in human history attempted to vanish into the chaos. Some succeeded, some were caught, and some, like the towering figure we'll examine today, required an extraordinary manhunt that would take Allied intelligence agents into the heart of Hitler's mythical Alpine fortress. This is the story of Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Himmler's second-in-command, the most senior SS officer to stand trial at Nuremberg and one of the principal architects of the Holocaust. Among the rogues gallery of senior Nazi officials, one man literally stood above the rest. At 6 feet 4 inches tall, with a face heavily marked by dueling scars, Ernst Kaltenbrunner cut an intimidating figure even among the brutal hierarchy of the SS. Born in October 1903 in Riedem-Innkreis, Austria, he came from respectable middle-class origins as the son of a lawyer. His childhood in the picturesque town near the German border was unremarkable in many ways, except for one fateful friendship. Young Ernst became close friends with a boy named Adolf Eichmann, a relationship that would later prove deadly for millions. Kaltenbrunner pursued his father's profession, obtaining a doctorate in law from Graz University in 1926. But the face that would become notorious at Nuremberg was already being shaped. During his university years, he threw himself into the brutal tradition of academic fencing, a practice that left permanent scars crisscrossing his face. These marks, combined with additional injuries from a car accident, gave him a menacing appearance that he would wear for the rest of his life. Some who met him later said he looked like a villain from a Gothic novel. Others said he looked exactly like what he became, a monster. In 1926, the young Dr. Kaltenbrunner opened his own law firm in Linz, the city that would later be so important to Adolf Hitler's own Austrian identity. For a few years, he practiced law in relative obscurity. But the political upheavals sweeping through Europe in the late 1920s would soon draw him into a very different career. In 1930, Kaltenbrunner joined the Nazi Party, seeing in Hitler's movement something that appealed to his authoritarian instincts and pan-Germanic nationalism. It was a decision that would change not just his life, but the lives of millions of victims he would never meet. In 1931, Kaltenbrunner took the next fateful step, joining the SS, Himmler's elite organization that styled itself as a racial vanguard. By 1933, he had already risen to become head of the Nazi Lawyers League in Linz, using his legal expertise to serve the party's interests. That same year, he married Elisabeth Ader, herself a committed Nazi Party member. Their marriage would produce 3 children and last until Kaltenbrunner's execution, with Elisabeth surviving until 2002, one of the last living widows of the Nazi elite, carrying her dark secrets into the 21st century. But being a Nazi in Austria during the early 1930s was no easy path. The Austrian government had banned the Nazi Party, viewing it correctly as a tool of German interference and a threat to Austrian independence. Kaltenbrunner and his fellow Austrian Nazis were forced underground, operating in secret, always one step ahead of the police. For Kaltenbrunner, this meant his law practice became a front for Nazi activities. He served as a legal consultant for the banned party and, critically, acted as a courier, smuggling information and orders between Austrian Nazis and their handlers across the border in Bavaria. His superior in this underground network was Reinhard Heydrich, the brilliant and ruthless chief of the SS Security Service. Heydrich recognized in Kaltenbrunner a man of absolute loyalty and cold efficiency, qualities highly valued in the SS. But underground work came with risks. In 1934, Kaltenbrunner was briefly imprisoned for participating in a conspiracy against the Austrian government. This was the year of the failed Nazi coup that resulted in the assassination of Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss. Though Kaltenbrunner wasn't directly involved in the murder, his connections to the conspiracy landed him in jail. He would return to prison the very next year, this time on the far more serious charge of high treason. Austrian authorities were becoming increasingly aware of the Nazi network operating within their borders, and Kaltenbrunner was one of its key figures. Though the treason charge was eventually dropped, possibly due to lack of concrete evidence, possibly due to Nazi intimidation, he still received a 6-month sentence for conspiracy. More damaging to his cover, he lost his license to practice law. His career as a respectable attorney was over, but his career as an SS officer was just beginning. Upon his release from prison, Kaltenbrunner was appointed leader of the Austrian SS, a significant promotion that placed him at the head of the Nazi underground in his homeland. His role as a high-level courier intensified with dangerous trips across the border to report to Heydrich in Bavaria. This work was perilous. In 1937, he was arrested yet again by Austrian authorities. But time was running out for an independent Austria. Hitler was consolidating his power in Germany and eyeing his homeland for annexation. Kaltenbrunner and his underground army were preparing the ground for what would become known as the Anschluss. March 1938 marked the end of Austrian independence and the beginning of Kaltenbrunner's rise to power. As German troops rolled across the border to the cheers of Austrian Nazi supporters, Kaltenbrunner played a crucial role in facilitating the takeover. The underground network he had built suddenly emerged into the light, providing intelligence, suppressing opposition, and ensuring a smooth transition to Nazi rule. His reward was swift and substantial. Kaltenbrunner was given a high position in the puppet Austrian government led by Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Nazi lawyer who served as Hitler's first governor of Austria. That same year, 1938, he was promoted to SS Brigade Führer, equivalent to a brigadier general, and was made a member of the German Reichstag. For a man who had been in prison just 3 years earlier, his rise was meteoric. But Kaltenbrunner wasn't content with political positions. He understood that real power in the Nazi state came from controlling the apparatus of terror. He threw himself into establishing Nazi institutions in Austria, particularly the concentration camp system. His most notorious achievement was setting up Mauthausen concentration camp near his old home city of Linz. Mauthausen would become one of the most brutal camps in the entire Nazi system, a Category 3 camp, meaning it was designated for the regime's worst enemies, where prisoners were literally worked to death in the brutal stone quarries. Tens of thousands would die there, and Kaltenbrunner bore direct responsibility for its creation. On September 11, 1938, Kaltenbrunner was advanced to SS Gruppenführer, equivalent to an army lieutenant general, and was made higher SS and police leader for all of Austria. He now controlled the entire SS and police apparatus in his homeland. In June 1940, he became chief of police in Vienna, giving him even more direct control over the mechanisms of oppression. The following month, he was commissioned into the Waffen-SS as a second lieutenant, an unusual move that gave him both political police authority and military rank. Kaltenbrunner was building something in Austria, an intelligence network that extended throughout the former nation and into the Balkans beyond. His work didn't go unnoticed in Berlin. Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler was watching this tall Austrian with interest. Himmler had a problem, and he thought Kaltenbrunner might be the solution. On May 27, 1942, a black Mercedes convertible slowed to take a hairpin turn in the Prague suburb of Holešovice. In the back seat sat SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich, Himmler's deputy, and the head of the Reich Main Security Office. What Heydrich didn't know was that 2 Czech resistance fighters trained in Britain were waiting at that exact corner. As the car slowed, they attacked, hurling a modified anti-tank mine into the vehicle. The explosion tore through the car, and shrapnel lodged in Heydrich's body. 8 days later, the man the Nazis called the Blonde Beast and the Hangman was dead. Heydrich's assassination left a massive void at the heart of the SS security apparatus. The Reich Main Security Office, the RSHA, controlled everything from the Gestapo to the SD intelligence service to the criminal police. It was the nerve center of Nazi terror, the organization that would ultimately coordinate the Holocaust. Finding a replacement for the brilliant, ruthless Heydrich was not easy. Himmler needed someone absolutely loyal, someone competent, someone who wouldn't threaten his own position. He chose Ernst Kaltenbrunner. In June 1942, Kaltenbrunner was appointed to replace Heydrich as chief of the RSHA. It was a position of extraordinary power. Under his command came the Sicherheitspolizei, the combined forces of the Gestapo secret police and the Kriminalpolizei criminal police, and the Sicherheitsdienst, the SS intelligence service. In June 1943, Himmler promoted him again, this time to SS Obergruppenführer and General of Police. At just 39 years old, Kaltenbrunner had reached the inner circle of Nazi power. He was now the second most powerful man in the SS, answerable only to Himmler himself. Interestingly, Kaltenbrunner also inherited a position that seems almost surreal in retrospect. Heydrich had served as president of the International Criminal Police Commission, the organization that would later become Interpol. This meant that the man coordinating the greatest crime in human history was also technically in charge of international law enforcement. The Nazis had a dark sense of irony, but there was nothing ironic about what Kaltenbrunner did with his power. He was completely loyal to Adolf Hitler, whom he genuinely believed had been sent by God to save Germany from its enemies. With that fanatical loyalty came an absolute ruthlessness in pursuing Nazi objectives, particularly the destruction of European Jewry. Under Kaltenbrunner's leadership, the final solution accelerated. He maintained careful oversight of the concentration camp system, ensuring the killing centers operated at maximum efficiency. In October 1943, Kaltenbrunner issued direct orders to SS Obersturmbannführer Herbert Kappler, the chief of German police and security forces in Rome, to begin the eradication of Italy's Jews. Kappler dutifully complied, rounding up thousands of Roman Jews and deporting them to Auschwitz. Most would die in the gas chambers within hours of arrival. This was typical of Kaltenbrunner's administrative style: cold, efficient, focused on results. He didn't personally pull triggers or operate gas chambers, but his orders set the machinery of death in motion across occupied Europe. In his personal life, Kaltenbrunner had begun an affair with Countess Gisela von Westarp, a member of Himmler's Berlin staff. Despite his marriage to Elizabeth and their 3 children, he maintained this relationship openly, even fathering twins with the Countess in March 1945. In the corrupt world of the Nazi elite, such behavior was common. Personal morality meant nothing to men who were organizing industrial-scale murder. The year 1944 would prove pivotal for Kaltenbrunner's role in Nazi crimes. That spring, German forces occupied Hungary, their erstwhile ally, whose regent, Admiral Horthy, had been reluctant to hand over Hungarian Jews to the Nazi killing machine. Kaltenbrunner was part of the negotiations that resulted in a new, thoroughly pro-Nazi government in Budapest. This opened the door for the final solution to be extended into Hungary with devastating effect. Kaltenbrunner's childhood friend, Adolf Eichmann, was dispatched to Budapest to organize the deportations. In just 8 weeks, Eichmann's machinery would deport over 400,000 Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz. It was the fastest, most intensive phase of the Holocaust. Trains packed with human cargo rolled day and night from Hungary to Poland. The gas chambers and crematoria at Auschwitz-Birkenau operated 24 hours a day, struggling to keep pace with the massive influx. Of the approximately 750,000 Jews in Hungary at the time, most would be dead by the end of the year. Kaltenbrunner and Eichmann, childhood friends from Austria, had collaborated on one of history's greatest atrocities. But Kaltenbrunner's most high-profile role came after the failed attempt on Hitler's life on July 20, 1944. A bomb planted by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg exploded in Hitler's East Prussian headquarters, the Wolf's Lair, but failed to kill the Führer. Hitler emerged from the wrecked building with only minor injuries, his rage boundless. He demanded vengeance, and Kaltenbrunner was given the task of extracting it. Leading the investigation into the conspiracy, Kaltenbrunner cast his net wide. The initial conspirators were quickly identified and executed, but Kaltenbrunner kept digging, finding connections and conspiracies everywhere he looked. Some were real, some were imagined, some were convenient excuses to eliminate rivals. In the end, approximately 5,000 people were executed in connection with the plot, and many thousands more were imprisoned. Officers were hanged with piano wire in a Berlin prison, their executions filmed for Hitler's viewing. The repression was savage and thorough, and Kaltenbrunner orchestrated all of it. In December 1944, in recognition of his services, Kaltenbrunner received his final promotion to General of the Waffen-SS, adding military command authority to his already extensive political and police powers. A cascade of awards followed: the Knight's Cross of the War, Merit Cross, a very rarely bestowed decoration, the Golden Party Badge, and the Blood Order, awarded to Old Guard Nazis. Kaltenbrunner had reached the absolute pinnacle of his career. But he was intelligent enough to read the strategic situation, and it was dire. The massive German offensive in the Ardennes, Hitler's last gamble in the West, had failed by January 1945. In the east, a colossal Soviet offensive had smashed through German lines and was racing toward Berlin. By February, Soviet forces were less than 100 kilometers from the German capital. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years would barely last 12. Kaltenbrunner, like other Nazi leaders, began thinking about survival. On April 18, 1945, Heinrich Himmler appointed Kaltenbrunner as Commander-in-Chief of German forces in southern Europe. It was a curious appointment. Kaltenbrunner had no real military experience beyond his nominal Waffen-SS commission. But Himmler was making preparations for after the fall, and he wanted loyalists in key positions. 2 days later, Kaltenbrunner dutifully appeared at the Reich Chancellery in Berlin to celebrate Hitler's 56th and final birthday. Soviet artillery was pounding the eastern suburbs of Berlin. The bunker atmosphere was surreal, a death cult going through its final rituals. Kaltenbrunner didn't linger. As soon as protocol allowed, he left Berlin for the last time and retreated to Austria and his new command. His destination was the Alpine region of Austria and Bavaria, an area that Nazi propaganda had designated as the National Redoubt, or Alpine Fortress. According to propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels' masterful disinformation campaign, this mountainous region would be the site of a last stand by fanatical Nazi troops. Hitler and his remaining loyalists would withdraw to the high mountains, where they could hold out for months or even years against Allied forces, supplied by underground factories and defended by mountain troops fighting from prepared positions. It was largely fantasy, but the Western Allies took the threat seriously enough to divert substantial military resources to crush any potential Alpine resistance. In reality, German forces in the region were demoralized and disorganized, and resistance was sporadic at best. But the region did hold something real and valuable: massive hoards of wealth. The Nazis had secreted enormous quantities of Reichsbank gold, currency, looted art treasures, and evacuated museum collections throughout the area, hidden in salt mines, mountain caves, and Alpine vaults. This was the real treasure of the National Redoubt. As American forces pushed into Austria in early May 1945, special teams from the Counterintelligence Corps, the CIC, accompanied the combat units. These teams had a specific mission: locate and arrest high-ranking Nazi officials and war criminals before they could escape or go underground. Leading one such team attached to the 319th Infantry Regiment, 80th Infantry Division, was Special Agent Robert E. Matheson, a determined investigator accompanied by his interpreter, Sidney Bruskin. On May 3, 1945, the 80th Infantry Division linked up with Soviet forces at Steyr on the Enns River, effectively cutting Austria in two. But there was no time to celebrate. The division was immediately redirected south into the heart of the supposed national redoubt. Matheson and his team went with them, their list of wanted war criminals in hand. They were looking for the big fish, Gauleiters, SS generals, ministers, men who had the blood of thousands or millions on their hands. Matheson caught his first break on May 5th in the small village of Wuchtdorf. Interrogating the local Nazi party leader, he learned that August Eigruber, the Gauleiter of Upper Austria, had recently passed through the village. More importantly, Eigruber had been heading for Gmunden, a resort town about 60 kilometers east of Salzburg. A Gauleiter was a significant prize. These men were the Nazi Party's regional dictators, wielding enormous power over life and death in their districts. The lead was technically outside Matheson's assigned area of operations, but he was a determined man and wasn't about to let a prize like Eigruber slip away. He and Bruskin drove to Gmunden in their jeep, navigating roads clogged with refugees and retreating German soldiers. When they arrived and questioned the local police, they received startling news. Yes, Gauleiter Eigruber had passed through about a week earlier, but he hadn't been alone. He had been accompanied by two men who were far bigger prizes: Dr. Robert Ley, the head of the German Labor Front, and Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Himmler's second-in-command and chief of the RSHA. Matheson must have felt his pulse quicken. Kaltenbrunner was one of the most wanted men in Europe. If the intelligence was accurate, all three men were heading for the Salzkammergut, a region of mountains dotted with salt mines in the heart of the supposed national redoubt. It was perfect terrain for hiding, hundreds of square kilometers of alpine wilderness with countless caves, mine shafts, and mountain huts. Finding one man in that vast area would be like finding a needle in a haystack. But Matheson was determined to try. Moving south with a U.S. tank battalion, Matheson had his first direct confrontation with the horrors of the Nazi regime. They passed through the Ebensee concentration camp, a sub-camp of the Mauthausen system that Kaltenbrunner himself had helped establish. The camp had just been liberated, and the scenes there were beyond description. Thousands of emaciated prisoners, many too weak to stand, surrounded by piles of corpses. The American soldiers, hardened by combat, were visibly shaken. For Matheson, it made the hunt personal. The man he was pursuing wasn't just a wanted criminal. He was responsible for this hell on earth. On May 6th, Matheson's team pushed 16 kilometers into the National Redoubt, but they encountered no resistance. At the resort town of Bad Ischl, once frequented by Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph I, they made contact with troops from the Austrian Freedom Movement, Wehrmacht soldiers who had turned against the Nazis and were now fighting to free Austria from remaining Nazi influence. It was a surreal encounter. German uniformed soldiers offering to help American intelligence agents hunt down SS officers. Leaving Bruskin in Bad Ischl to organize a network of informants, Matheson accompanied an Austrian Freedom Movement lieutenant and several of his men, still in their Wehrmacht uniforms and heavily armed, toward the town of Strobel. The road was chaos, clogged with men and vehicles of the 6th SS Panzer Army retreating eastward from the advancing Americans toward the Soviets. The weary Waffen-SS troops, focused on their own survival, paid little attention to Matheson's mixed group of American and Austrian troops in the confusion. In Strobel, Matheson questioned the mayor and finally got hot intelligence. Kaltenbrunner's party had been staying at a villa on the outskirts of town very recently. Moving quickly in two cars, Matheson and the Austrian troops approached the estate. As they walked up to the front door, they noticed several German military types in civilian clothes watching them from a distance. These men didn't interfere, but followed discreetly, clearly bodyguards or security personnel. The door was opened by a blonde woman in her late 30s, Elisabeth Kaltenbrunner. Her 3 children were visible in the house behind her. Matheson questioned her about her husband's whereabouts, but she was evasive. Ernst Kaltenbrunner was not there. Reading the situation quickly, Matheson placed Frau Kaltenbrunner under arrest and warned the bodyguards in civilian clothes that U.S. troops would arrive shortly to secure the area. There was no resistance. The chief bodyguard explained that Kaltenbrunner had ordered them to protect his family, but with the war clearly over and an American directive for all Austrians to turn in their weapons, they had complied and had no intention of fighting. Frau Kaltenbrunner and her children were placed in a car and driven to 80th Infantry Division headquarters. During her interrogation, she revealed crucial information. Yes, her husband had been at the villa at Strobel on May 3rd. He had held a meeting there, attended by many senior Nazis: Gauleiter Friedrich Reiner of Salzburg, the RSHA Foreign Intelligence Chiefs Wilhelm Waneck and Wilhelm Hürtel, SS Oberführer Kajetan Mühlmann, and perhaps most intriguingly, SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's famous commando leader who had rescued Mussolini from imprisonment and was a personal friend of Kaltenbrunner's. Meanwhile, Bruskin and Bad Ischl had established that the center of Nazi activity in the region was the town of Alte See, nestled about 30 kilometers south of Strobel in the Todtsgebirge, the Dead Mountains. This remote area was perfect for hiding, with rugged terrain and limited access. If Kaltenbrunner was anywhere, it would be there. On May 8, 1945, VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, the 80th Infantry Division assembled a task force to push into Alte See. The war in Europe was officially over, but there were concerns that fanatical Nazis might continue fighting in the mountainous national redoubt. The task force consisted of a company of infantry and several Sherman tanks under the command of Major Ralph Pearson. Matheson and his CIC team went with them. The drive through the Perched Pass was spectacular, spring meadows bursting with wildflowers against a backdrop of massive snow-capped peaks. Reaching Bad Aussee, the column paused for rest before pushing on. The road climbed higher and higher into the mountains until 4 kilometers further on they reached Alte See, the last major settlement before the Dead Mountains. The town sat beside a pristine Alpine lake with towering peaks beyond. It looked like a postcard, not a hideout for war criminals. But appearances were deceiving. Alte See contained the summer homes of several prominent Nazi Gauleiters: Konrad Henlein, Rudolf Jung, and August I. Gruber. The town was also near the entrance to the Alte See salt mine, where the Nazis had hidden thousands of looted art treasures. Local rumors said that Kaltenbrunner and other wanted Nazis had taken refuge in high mountain huts in the Todtsgebirge, but pinpointing exactly where required patient intelligence work. Matheson's first discovery was an RSHA radio transmitting station at the Villa Carey on the outskirts of Alte See. This was Kaltenbrunner's only remaining method of communication with other Nazi groups in the region. CIC agents quickly seized the station and shut it down, cutting Kaltenbrunner off from any remaining network. The villa also yielded 2 important persons closely associated with Kaltenbrunner: his mistress, Countess Gisela von Westarp, and Frau Scheidler, the wife of his adjutant. Both women were taken into custody for questioning. Through careful interrogation of these women and others in the town, Matheson pieced together the situation. Before the U.S. column had reached Alte See, Kaltenbrunner had fled with his adjutant, SS Sturmbannführer Scheidler, and 2 other SS men. All 4 had taken to the hills dressed in civilian clothes, but well armed. They were prepared to resist capture if necessary. But where exactly in the vast expanse of the Dead Mountains were they hiding? On May 11th, Matheson finally got the information he needed. Kaltenbrunner's group was supposedly hiding in a mountain hut called the Wildensee Hütte, perched high in the Todtsgebirge. Getting there would not be easy. It required a climb of at least 5 hours through difficult terrain. Matheson recruited 4 Austrian mountain guides, all former German Army mountain troops who knew the area intimately. Major Pearson, concerned about the possibility of armed resistance, insisted that the CIC detachment be accompanied by a squad of U.S. infantry. Matheson was given command of the entire operation. Before departing, Matheson obtained a note from Countess von Westarp to Kaltenbrunner explaining the situation and assuring him that he would be safe in U.S. custody. It was a calculated move. Perhaps the note would convince Kaltenbrunner to surrender peacefully rather than force a firefight on a remote mountaintop. At 11:30 p.m. on May 11th, the team assembled for a final briefing. At midnight, the long hike began. The route was treacherous. Heavy snowslides covered parts of the path, and trees had been swept down by avalanches, blocking the way. The team had to navigate by moonlight and the dim glow of hooded flashlights, climbing steadily upward through increasingly difficult terrain. The altitude and the pace took their toll. 3 of the infantrymen had to be left behind due to injuries sustained during the climb. By 5 a.m., just before dawn, the exhausted team finally reached a snow-covered pass and could see their objective, the Wildenser Hütte. The situation was less than ideal for an approach. The land around the hut provided minimal cover, making it difficult to get close without being seen. However, the hut itself looked deserted. No smoke came from its chimney, and no movement could be detected. All the shutters were firmly locked. Had Kaltenbrunner received warning and fled, or was this a trap? Matheson made a quick decision. Leaving the guides and the remaining infantry behind a snow ridge about 300 yards from the cabin, he would approach alone via the cabin's blind side. Moving carefully through the snow, Matheson reached the front door of the hut. He knocked, then tried the handle. Locked. But then came a sound from inside, a man groaning. Matheson hammered on a window shutter. After a moment, it opened, and a rough-looking man, aged about 35, peered out and asked in German what he wanted. Matheson asked to come inside, but the man refused. Thinking quickly, Matheson handed over Countess von Westarp's note through the window. The man took the note and read it carefully. Then he looked at Matheson and said flatly that he didn't know these people. It was an obvious lie, but Matheson didn't press the point. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder and saw the 4 Austrian guides, rifles slung over their shoulders, casually walking up toward the hut in plain view. The man in the hut saw them too and panicked. He quickly crossed the room, and Matheson caught a glimpse of him picking up a pistol. Matheson immediately retreated to the side of the building, out of the line of fire. The remaining 8 U.S. infantrymen moved up and formed a semicircle in front of the hut, weapons at the ready. The situation was tense. 4 armed men inside a mountain hut, cornered, with nowhere to run. Matheson and the others called out for the men inside to surrender, making it clear that resistance was futile. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. The occupants of the hut remained silent. Had they decided to fight it out? Was Kaltenbrunner preparing to commit suicide rather than face capture? Finally, after what seemed an eternity, the door slowly opened. 4 men emerged with their hands held high above their heads. Among them stood an unmistakable figure. Tall, towering over the others, his heavily scarred face instantly recognizable. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the second most powerful man in the SS, Himmler's deputy, the coordinator of the final solution, had been captured without a shot being fired. Inside the hut, the Allied troops found an arsenal: 4 Mauser rifles, 4 pistols, a large quantity of ammunition, 2 MP-40 submachine guns, and an MG-42 machine gun, one of the most feared weapons of World War II. Kaltenbrunner and his men had been prepared for a last stand. They could have turned the hut into a fortress and fought to the death. But in the end, surrounded and cut off, they chose survival over martyrdom. The searchers also found something interesting in the fire pit: various papers and identification documents that had been partially burned. Among them were Kaltenbrunner's identity card as chief of the RSHA and his metal SS dog tags. He had tried to destroy evidence of his identity, hoping perhaps to pose as a simple soldier or civilian. But it was too late. There was also a large quantity of counterfeit US dollars and British pounds. Perhaps Kaltenbrunner had been planning to use them to escape and start a new life somewhere far from Europe. Despite the overwhelming evidence, all 4 men refused to admit their identities. They gave false names and claimed to be simple soldiers, separated from their units. Matheson didn't argue with them. He had them secured and began the long climb back down the mountain. At 11:30 in the morning, the party and their prisoners arrived back in Alps. As they emerged into the town, 2 women ran forward, Countess von Westarp and Frau Scheidler. They embraced their men, and the pretense was over. There was no longer any point denying who they were. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the evil giant of the SS, had been caught. Kaltenbrunner and his adjutant were sent on to higher U.S. headquarters for intensive interrogation. The intelligence value of capturing such a senior Nazi official was enormous. What did he know about Hitler's final days? Where were other Nazi leaders hiding? Where was the looted gold and art? Where were the documents that could prove Nazi war crimes? But Kaltenbrunner was not a cooperative prisoner. In July 1945, he was flown to London for further interrogation at the notorious London Cage, an MI5-run facility where high-value prisoners were subjected to intensive and sometimes brutal questioning. But the harsh treatment actually backfired. Kaltenbrunner, who had spent years as an interrogator himself, knew the techniques being used on him and responded by clamming up entirely. He refused to cooperate with his interrogators at all, giving them nothing of value. By this time, the Allies had decided to hold a major war crimes trial in Nuremberg. 21 of the most senior surviving Nazis would face justice in the courtroom. Kaltenbrunner would be among them. In October 1945, he was flown to Nuremberg and placed in a cell in the prison attached to the Palace of Justice. With Heinrich Himmler dead by suicide in British custody shortly after his capture, Kaltenbrunner was the most senior surviving SS official. That put a target on his back. The other defendants at Nuremberg gave Kaltenbrunner the cold shoulder from the very beginning. Men like Hermann Göring, Albert Speer, and Franz von Papen had a strategy. Blame everything on Hitler, Himmler, and their closest associates. Distance themselves from the worst crimes, claim they didn't know about the Holocaust, the concentration camps, the mass murders. Kaltenbrunner, as Himmler's second-in-command, was a convenient scapegoat. If they could push all the blame onto the SS leadership, perhaps some of them might escape the gallows. During the trial, which lasted from November 1945 to October 1946, the evidence against Kaltenbrunner was overwhelming. His signature appeared on countless documents ordering deportations, executions, and reprisals. Witnesses testified to his direct involvement in the machinery of the Holocaust. His role in the investigation after the July 20th plot was extensively documented. Even his own staff testified against him. Kaltenbrunner's defense was weak and contradictory. He claimed he had merely been an administrator, that he hadn't known about the worst excesses, that orders had come from above him. But the evidence showed otherwise. He had visited concentration camps. He had issued direct orders for killings. He had personally overseen the expansion of the final solution into Hungary. The judges were not convinced. On October 1, 1946, the verdicts were handed down. Ernst Kaltenbrunner was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The sentence was death by hanging, 8 days. That's all it took Robert Matheson to track down one of history's most wanted men, from a whispered name in a farmhouse to a dawn arrest on a freezing mountaintop. Kaltenbrunner wasn't some wild-eyed fanatic. He was a lawyer, a bureaucrat, a man who organized genocide with the same efficiency others bring to running a business. That's what makes his story so chilling. Evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it wears a suit and signs paperwork. But here's what matters. Justice won. A determined American agent, 4 Austrian mountain guides who chose the right side, and 1 dangerous midnight climb brought the evil giant down from his hiding place. No amount of destroyed documents or remote mountain huts could save him. On October 16, 1946, Kaltenbrunner hanged at Nuremberg. His ashes were scattered, so no shrine could ever mark his grave. But the principles established at his trial, that you can't hide behind orders, that war criminals will be hunted to the ends of the earth, those principles changed the world. The Wildense Hütte still stands today. Hikers pass through with no idea that one of World War II's final acts played out at that very spot. The mountains remain silent witnesses to both humanity's darkest crimes and our capacity for justice. The 1,000-year Reich lasted 12 years. The hunt for its leaders took 8 days. And the lesson? There's nowhere evil can run that determined people won't follow. Thanks for watching. Hit subscribe, because these stories matter. History's darkest chapters must be remembered so they're never repeated.